So, hello everyone, and this is now chapter 16 on the Federal Reserve System of the United States, and we'll be looking at it in all its aspects. And just so the Central Federal Reserve is in Washington, D.C., and there's 12 basically district Federal Reserve banks around the United States. So as you know, there's one down on Liberty Street in New York City, downtown New York, that's got the gold in the basement. And if you've never had a chance to go there, I suggest you go visit it. It's an exciting thing, and it's wonderful to see all that gold behind bars. So let me just show you before we go on. There's a nice website, and it's called Federal Reserve History, and it's the Fed's functions, right? And they got related resources. This is a wonderful site. Your gateway to the history of the Federal Reserve System. And they always feature a person here. Okay, and basically there's articles here about one of the topics is the Fed's role during World War One, right? And how they issued bonds and everything. And they also have a lot of nice stuff here on the Fed's functions, right? Uh, Conducting monetary policy and keeping inflation low and low unemployment, right? The 2% target usually. And there's a bunch of essays by topic here, and it's really a wonderful site. So I kind of suggest you visit this site. So here's more stuff, tweets on the history. So you're going here, and you can pick like a people to look at. And here's here's the period of great inflation. They have different time periods, right? Modernization, and here's the whole thing on the aftermath of the Great Recession. And I'm sure this will be updated to include this current period now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And they have a nice thing here, like before the Fed. Okay, so this is really worth looking at. Here's all the current board of governors and the presidents of each Fed. So, for instance, if you wanted to find out what happened with the Great Recession and how they dealt with the Great Recession and the TARP program, you could just click on that, and I don't know why it should be coming. I'm surprised it isn't. I would think we would. But anyway, that one doesn't seem to be working for some reason. I don't know why they. All right, I'll try to figure out how to get those to work. But so let's get back to the slides a little bit. So we're going to look at the Federal Reserve Bank. So we'll look at, as I just showed you, the historical context of the development of the Federal Reserve System, and we'll describe the key features and functions of the Federal Reserve, what they do, and how independent is the Fed, and known as the lender of last resort. All right, so there's always been arguments about the Fed and the independence of it. All right, pros and cons, and we'll look at how the Federal Reserve compares to the European central banks. Okay, and we'll look at other other central banks around the world. All right, so here's some of the origins of the Federal Reserve System. There was always fear of having centralized power in America in general, and that's why they created the states, right? So there's been always been resistance to the establishment of a central bank, okay, because of this fear of centralized power. The only problem was there was no lender of last resort in America back then in the early 1900s. And there was always bank panics on a regular basis because there wasn't regulation and laws. So back in 1907, there was a run on the banks. In 1907, there was a huge panic. And basically, at that point, they realized there's got to be a Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve System. So, so that's the way that went. I'm up on the Fed history site. Okay, so you can see here one of the topics I picked was before the Fed, right here, and basically you can see you can click on each of these and get the history. The United States made several attempts to regulate banks and manage the money supply at a national level before the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And they gathered at an island called Jekyll Island, 1910, that laid the Fed's foundations. And that was basically because of the panic of 1907. And that inspired monetary reform. And then there were other there's been bank panics over the years during the Gilded Age. So you can see that. And basically over here, they basically created the first Bank of the United States in 1791. And I believe this one disappeared. And then the second Bank of the United States was the second attempt at creating a central bank in 1816. So let's look at so so in 1907 there was a global financial crisis, and this inspired monetary reform movement and led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. So the Panic of 1907 was the first worldwide financial crisis of the 20th century. It transformed the recession into a contraction, surpassed in severity only by the Great Depression of the 1930s. The panic's impact is still felt today because it spurred the monetary reform movement that led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. Moen and Talman argued that the experience of the Panic of 1907 changed how New York clearinghouse bankers perceived the value of a central bank because the panic took hold mainly among trust companies, institutions outside their membership. So this was the Panic of 1907. Okay, and there's a link, and there's a related link here for that, and these are the people who were involved. So I'll go back, and over here you can see there was other bank panics of the Gilded Age. And here's J.P. Morgan, who was the richest man of America. If you never had a chance, go visit the J.P. Morgan Museum on 37th Street and his library and his museum. It's a fascinating place. He was the richest guy in the world back then. So, so back here is another article here, right? Banking panics of the Gilded Age. The late 19th century saw the expansion of the U.S. financial system, but was also beset by banking panics. Okay. So the Gilded Age in U.S. history spans from roughly the end of the Civil War through the very early 1900s. So basically, there was a lot of bank panics here, and this is a really interesting read. You can see there were panics in 1884, 1890, 1899, 1901, and 1908 were confined to New York. But the panic of 1907 was the shock that finally spurred financial and political leaders. So there's been a history of bank runs and bank failures. Okay, so it's worth looking up on. So here's the Federal Reserve Act, and it basically created checks and balances, and it decentralized the banks. So to make everyone happy, there were 12 branches all across the country. And the reason they did that was because the people who created it wanted to diffuse the power along regional lines between the private sector and the government, and among bankers, business people, and the public. So that's the way that went. So this diffusion of power has resulted basically in the evolution of the Federal Reserve System to include the following entities: the 12 banks themselves. Then there's the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Okay, who meet regularly, and then there's the Federal Open Market Committee and the Federal Advisory Council. And there's roughly around 2,900 member banks. So you can see here that the from the Federal Reserve history site that the Federal Reserve banks opened for business, and the 12 locations of the decentralized component of the Federal Reserve System opened for business on November 16th, 1914, just 7 months after the locations were selected. The opening of these banks mark a new era in the history of business and finance in this country. It is believed that they will put an end to the annual anxiety from which the country has suffered for the past generation about insufficient money and credit to move the crops each year, and will give such stability to the banking business that the extreme fluctuations in interest rates and available credits which have characterized banking in the past will be destroyed permanently. And that was Treasury Secretary William McAdoo who quoted all that. So, some 7 months after the Reserve Bank Organization Committee announced which cities and districts were selected, and we could probably see them, right? See the So here's the districts, right? You could see U.S. bank system announced, and here's the 12 districts, right? There's one in New York, and the 12th covers this area of the West, and here's Texas, and so there's 12 locations. So that's kind of the way that went.
And now a brief lesson on the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve, or the Fed, is the central bank of the United States. As the central bank, it determines our nation's monetary policy. This means the Fed determines how much money is floating around in the U.S. economic ecosystem, ready to be spent on goods or services. By controlling the money supply, the Fed is able to influence both interest rates and the health of the overall economy. The Fed's goal is to keep two important economic metrics in check: unemployment and inflation. The Federal Reserve has a few tools to influence the economy, but its primary focus is the federal funds rate. This is the rate banks use when they lend to one another. Let's look at how this works. Banks are required to keep a certain amount of customer deposits on hand. This is called the reserve requirement and is set by the Fed. If a bank is short one night, it'll call another bank and borrow money so it can meet the requirement. By influencing this interbank rate, the Fed also influences other short-term rates. Here's how it works. Banks profit by borrowing money at one rate and lending it out at a higher rate. Now suppose the Fed increases the federal funds rate. Banks don't want to borrow at a higher rate and then loan at a lower rate. This would cause banks to lose a lot of money. So when borrowing rates increase, a bank raises the rate it charges its customers. This is how an increase in the federal funds rate can cause a ripple effect throughout short-term rates. These changes in interest rates also impact the U.S. economy. For example, if the economy shows signs of slowing, the Federal Reserve will lower short-term rates in an attempt to turn things around. As a result of this, banks will decrease the rates for their customers. These low rates make it cheaper to borrow and less attractive to save. This leads to increased spending, borrowing, and investing. The Fed hopes these actions will lead to economic expansion. Changing an interest rate isn't as easy as turning a dial. To drive the federal funds rate toward its target, the Fed uses open market operations. This is where the Fed enters the bond market to buy and sell government securities. Doing this influences supply and demand and thereby changes the federal funds rate. Historically, the Fed's open market operations only bought and sold short-term government securities and therefore only influenced short-term interest rates. However, as a result of the Great Recession, the Fed has employed more unconventional monetary policy and has started purchasing longer-term securities. It did this to influence long-term interest rates. This process is known as quantitative easing, or QE. The Fed's actions can impact key economic measures like unemployment and inflation. For example, reducing long-term rates allows the Fed to help lower rates on mortgages or other types of loans. This could lead to things like people buying new homes or companies taking out loans to build a new factory or launch a new product line. These new commercial projects lead to companies hiring more people and thereby increase employment. However, when the economy grows too quickly or grows for a long period of time, it can cause inflation. Inflation is the rising cost of goods and services. To reduce inflation, the Fed increases rates, making it more expensive to borrow money. When it's too expensive to borrow money, businesses will reduce expansion and consumers will start to spend less. This decreased demand will cause prices to fall, lowering inflation. Now that you have an idea of how the Federal Reserve influences interest rates and the purposes of open market operations, you should be more comfortable when you're reading the highlights of the FOMC meeting when they're published.